welcome everybody, both here and there. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm a humanities editor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, one of the co-organizers of the workshop in material texts, joined in this endeavor by Zach Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English here at Penn, and Sean Pollack, Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, which is where those of us who are sitting in Van Pelt are currently sitting. Ordinarily, we're ably aided and abetted by the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, Eileen Malcolm, who is today, I think, pulling the strings from a remote location. And somewhere out there, we also hope our founding director, Peter Stallybrass, may be listening in. For those of you who are in the room, an attendance sheet should be being passed around, and please do sign that, both because we want to know you're here and because of COVID protocols. For those of you who are zooming in, we want you, of course, to be as actively present as possible. And Zach will be curating the chat during the presentation and will flag any questions posed through the chat to me. But I also encourage you all to use the raise hand function in your Zoom during the discussion so that we may recognize and call upon you, and so you can pose your questions in your own voices. We do hope that the audio quality for those of you not here will be hugely improved over what was the case last week, because we now have a microphone set up so that you should be able to hear what's going on in the room as well as we can hear you through the screens. One bit of material texts nice business is we have just learned that Courtney Dalton, who when she was an undergraduate at Bryn Mawr was actually one of the most faithful attendees of the seminar over the years, and who went on to library school, has just gotten a job with the Cornell University Law Library, and we're delighted to learn that. So congratulations, Courtney, and great luck, and we hope you will pass through Philadelphia at some point, and we can all have Chinese dinner together. Okay, so on to this evening. It really is a pleasure to welcome Meg Leja back to Penn, where she was a fellow at the Wolf Humanities Center for the academic year 2017-2018. Meg is currently assistant professor of history at Binghamton University, where her teaching focuses on the political, cultural, and medical history of late antique and early medieval Europe. In addition to the fellowship at Penn, she's been recipient of fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Binghamton, the Center for the Study of Religions at Princeton, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which supported her graduate work at Princeton, from which she took her PhD in history in 2015. Meg's work has appeared in the journals Viator, Comitatus, and the English Historical Review. And this spring, her monograph, Embodying the Soul, Medicine and Religion in Carolingian Europe, will appear in the Middle Ages series at the University of Pennsylvania Press. This evening's talk, which continues our semester's cluster of presentations on pre-modern medical and scientific material texts, draws on the forthcoming book. In that work, Meg looks at how for the Carolingians, and I'm probably simplifying, and I hope not misrepresenting her. Okay, she looks at how for the Carolingians, body and soul were not to be understood as being in conflict, but rather as components to be brought into balance with one another. As an instrument for achieving this, she argues, the Carolingians turned to the medical knowledge of Greco-Roman antiquity and sought to recuperate and activate this within a Christian context generally, and within the spiritual, social, and political worlds of the Carolingians more specifically. When looked at from this perspective, she argues, the distinction between medical and spiritual texts melts away. Embedded within the surviving corpus of Carolingian manuscript materials, she finds a much, much larger body of medical writing than has previously been recognized. As James T. Palmer has observed, Leja's work convincingly demonstrates that for the Carolingians, the study of pagan medicine was never simply what he says he calls a niche monastic and antiquarian concern, but rather something deeply relevant to their world more broadly. And in her comments on the manuscript, Linda Kuhn praised Leja for revealing what she called, quote, a Carolingian culture of medical science and practice that is holistic, multidimensional, and dynamic. No one to date has considered the major events and actors through a therapeutic lens, Kuhn continues. Familiar topics metamorphose into unfamiliar terrain under her gaze. Embodying the soul is destined to be a classic in the field of Carolingian and medical history. So please join me in welcoming Meg Leja, who will speak to us this evening on the topic of Mending Bodies by Amending Texts, Medical Manuscripts from the Early Middle Ages. And I'm going to move.
Thank you so much for the chance to be here. Thank you so much, Jerry. It's very exciting. I haven't given a talk in person in 2.25 years, so it's thrilling to be here. And I'm going to try to talk as loud as possible, so let me know if you can't hear me. So in this talk, as you already know, I'm going to be focusing on the early Middle Ages and on the Carolingian period in particular. So I'm going to put up this map because I'm not going to say too much about the Carolingians. And bizarrely, I don't think I'm going to name a single person or a single author who lived during this period. I normally try to avoid this when I give talks, but I was hoping that a workshop on material texts would let me get away with it, because my focus is on the manuscripts produced in the late 8th and the 9th centuries. And for these, we have mostly silence on who commissioned, wrote them, and read these codices. Still, I want to insist that we have visible signs of scribal agency and that this reveals a dynamic thought and a theoretical complexity that guided medical scholarship in a period still frequently and really recently characterized as devoid of theory or true medical learning because of the way that the translations of Greek classics failed to make their way into Latin and thus into the Western Mediterranean for the centuries before 1000. So early medieval medical writings have suffered from what I see to be a double neglect. First, within broader histories of medicine, Latin manuscripts between the 6th and 11th centuries continue to be framed as the nadir of innovation and intellectual endeavor. It's as if scholars believe that in the pre-modern past, only one world region at a time can serve as the center of medical scholarship, and that only one kind of medical learning counts. And this is copying and studying texts within the authentic corpus of Hippocrates and Galen. So given the extraordinary vigor of the work undertaken in this vein by Arabic scholars working in Abbasid Baghdad, as indicated here, the texts Latin authors were engaged with have received little attention. But this is not an either-or scenario, right? In fact, innovation there in Baghdad could have spurred new ideas here, say in Aachen, the capital of the Carolingians. But that's a topic for another time or later, maybe. So the second form of neglect comes not from longue durée narratives of historians of medicine, but from medievalists themselves. For later medievalists, setting up an image of the Dark Ages is useful if one wants to emphasize regeneration, such as that occurring in southern Italy in the 11th century as new translations from Arabic flooded the scholarly scene. Even other early medievalists have hesitated to ascribe any significance to medical learning. The manuscripts that survive are assumed to be a handful against a much larger corpus of liturgical, theological, hagiographical works. Our lack of specifics about early medieval doctors, names, locations, training, make practice be really iffy, and the texts are notoriously difficult to pin down in terms of authorship, origin, and vocabulary. So most early medievalists are kind of like, let's just not talk too much about those. So first, I'd like to offer some fairly recent data that speaks to this long-standing picture. The bedrock for understanding medicine from the 8th through 11th centuries is 2 catalogs produced by Augusto Beccaria and Ernest Wickersheimer. And Beccaria offers a total manuscript count of 145. And Wickersheimer 119, but he's looking only at French archives. And this is, up through the 11th century. So say if we take just the 9th century, this means that we have around 70 codices with medical material out of about 9,000 total extant manuscripts, which does seem small, right? If we follow these earlier catalogers who did, an extraordinary amount of work. I'm certainly not criticizing them. But I am part of a new research group, tentatively now called Beyond Beccaria, that is showing that these numbers are in fact vast underestimates. So if we concentrate less on classical or traditional medical writings and more on what we're in this group calling medicine in the margins, we've actually located 450, as you can see here, for the same period covered by Beccaria. So if we compare 145 to 450, the extent to which we can gauge interest in medical knowledge in the early Middle Ages starts, I think, to look a little bit different. The other factor I'd like to consider in thinking about our extant evidence is the sheer diversity of the texts that we encounter. So by this, I don't mean diversity of genre or format. Indeed, most texts that we have are one of really just a few types, right? We have the herbal, we have the recipe collection, we have really short theoretical overviews, bloodletting instructions, prognostics about illness, so what's going to happen to the sick person, and dietary instructions. That covers just about everything. Instead, I mean the diversity of versions within each of these categories. So none of the medical manuscripts extant from the 9th century are identical, and no two derive in their entirety from the same exemplar. At the level of the individual text, then, it is very, very difficult to trace relationships among the different versions because of so many structural and linguistic differences, right? We just can't produce, for those of you familiar with manuscript sema, right, we can't produce something like this for most of the texts that we're talking about, or we're definitely not there yet. And I think for most of them, it's not possible. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but I do want to emphasize that the patterns among the various versions point to a large volume of material that must have been in circulation, but has subsequently been lost, right? I mean, a ton of medieval material has been lost, of course, but the medical material, it seems like a huge volume was there that just doesn't survive. And whether this is because medical texts were being used in therapeutic settings and were destroyed more easily, I mean, who knows, right? But this diversity also points to the creative license of scribes, whose names we don't know, but who freely mixed and matched titles and authors. They added and deleted words and passages. They rearranged the formats of different texts according to their own sensibility. So far from being stagnant, early medieval medicine was a fairly dynamic genre for its time. Authors could play around with what they believed were ancient texts, right, in a way that is different than if we look at theological treatises. They introduced ingredients and recipes reflecting new trade routes across the Mediterranean. They copied texts called antivolumina, which were lists of substitute herbs, right? I need this herb, but it's not available here, so I can substitute it with this. Right? So we see a lot of work going in to even these herbals that are transmitted. So rather than spending more time on the corpus as a whole, I'd like to dive into a specific example. If you have a handout, it's number 1, but it's also going to be on my slides. And this is one of my favorite manuscripts from the period, because although it's very short, it gives us, I think, a pretty clear sense of scribal agency. It was written around the end of the 9th century from a writing center, probably with Breton connection. And at base, I would call this a medical manuscript because its original core is almost exclusively medical material. There's just a really short snippet from Erosius's Contra Paganos at the start, but the rest of it is medical. And this medical material begins with a letter purporting to be from the evangelist Luke, which promises to set forth medical teachings appropriate to Christians. So it is known that Hippocrates, a medicus or doctor, composed several works during the time of the pagans, and that consequently in these works, some things are obscure and others are heathen. We who administer the cures of the art of medicine and are Christians and possess the books of Hippocrates give sanction to whatever Hippocrates said that was useful. But whatever he relayed, either obscurely or insufficiently, we elucidate and rewrite so that those reading his works may better understand. Whatever additional material we may insert there is from the books of St. Isidore, St. Augustine, St. Gregory, and Luke the Evangelist, i.e. myself, because all these men dictated much about the art of medicine. In these endeavors, we trust in the future help of our Lord Jesus Christ that the work of our art may accomplish increasingly more, just as our books are corrected, so as to become free from error by him who is an all-powerful medicus, and this is God. This is the only copy of this letter to survive. There are two much later manuscripts that preserve a version that includes just the opening and the closing, but nothing of the meaty middle. A fact that strongly suggests that our copy here comes from a scribe's decision to expand upon a really short pre-existing framework. We can't say for sure when this happened, but it has to be after about 650 because of the reference to Isidore, who died in 636. The fact that the only known copy dates from the 9th century, together with the reference to correcting books, which was a key endeavor of the Carolingian educational reforms, seems to me to make a 9th century date most probable. Nothing guaranteed, but the most likely. So we have a letter attributed to the evangelist Luke, but most likely composed in the 9th century, which presents as its central message the idea that pagan knowledge can be turned to Christian ends, and further, that the Christian doctor operates with God's approval and assistance in administering cures from books. Much of the authority of the message rests on the fame of its author. Just as Luke channeled God's voice in writing the gospel, so does he convey God's plan for human society in this brief text. Luke implies that it was always part of the divine plan for medical learning to emerge in the age of pagans like Hippocrates, but then be corrected and extended, and thereby perfected in Christian times. With its focus on the unfolding of knowledge over time, the text offers a history of medicine framed within a Christian progress narrative. The letter acts as a preface to the more specific medical knowledge that follows. In this way, it sets the reader up with a reading methodology, right? A way of processing and framing the material that he or she is about to encounter. First comes a series of anatomical texts. So this is from folio 3 to 6. And these are focused in particular on the growth of the fetus in the womb and the seat of the soul within the bodily organ. The information is credited to Hippocrates and Augustine of Hippo, two authorities who are mentioned in the letter of Luke, although most of the material is in fact drawn from a work by Vindicianus, the late 4th century North African physician, and Isidore, the early 7th century bishop of Seville. Next, as you can see here, folio 6 verso, comes a dialogue, a supposed dispute between Plato and Aristotle on the nature of the soul and its location within the fluids that run throughout the body. There are two versions of this dialogue that survive from the early Middle Ages. And in the first version, Aristotle wins the debate by showing that a man who undergoes bloodletting without any kind of restraint keels over and dies. And thus, says Aristotle, the soul must be blood itself. This is a very, very simple debate. In the second version, which is the one contained in our manuscript, the reviser, or a reviser, has corrected the text to make clear that Plato and Aristotle were pagans and presented some true and some false beliefs. On the idea that the soul is blood, the reviser offers a resounding correction by employing a similar experimental scenario. So in this case as well, a man is bled, too much blood is allowed to flow out, and the man dies. But the reviser adds, then dogs come and lick up the spilled blood. If the soul had been blood, the reviser declares, the dogs who lick up the blood would have been able to gulp down the soul. Just consider how stupid it would be to say that. Whoever thinks this demonstrates that he is an idiot. So the reviser presents an alternative explanation, describing the body-soul relationship, I would say, like a series of nested Russian dolls. Right? We have the skin that encloses the flesh, which encloses the veins, which encloses the blood, which enclose the breath and vital heat, which in turn enclose the soul. So with this imagery, the reviser manages to avoid equating the soul with blood, which would make it too material for Christian theology, while still enabling the soul to be localized inside the body and affected by the body's well-being, right? If you affect the blood, then you affect the soul, so they're not the same thing. In sum, this manuscript presents a series of texts with close thematic connections, and these connections are further emphasized by the detailed attention to structure. So just to go back to our list of contents, right? We have the letter of Luke that opens, that opens the collection, right? And then the anatomical material is actually sanctioned by Luke. So if we look at the very end of it, it says, Luke demonstrates this ordering of the human body. Questions about the soul are addressed in the anatomical material, and then again in the imagined dispute. In fact, when a later scribe came across this volume in the 12th century, he or she inserted a copy of Augustine's 4th century treatise on the magnitude of the soul at the end of the dispute, a move that suggests this 12th century individual too recognized a coherence to the collection. The thoughtfulness and precision revealed in the manuscript's production points clearly to the scribe acting with an agenda and not just hastily throwing together text. As part of this agenda, we see not just an interest in the body-soul relationship, but also a desire to prove the compatibility of pagan and Christian knowledge schemes. Hence the insistence that Augustine and Hippocrates agree in this anatomical section, and that Plato and Aristotle's teaching need to be corrected rather than eradicated, right? Why copy this text at all? To correct the things that they said, but you still include it. So the way in which medical material is presented in the Breton manuscript leans strongly towards the philosophical. What is highlighted is theoretical material on the nature of body and soul, and figures associated with philosophy like Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, and Neoplatonists play a starring role. There is little evidence of the practical, right? No recipes, no bloodletting instructions, no dietary advice, such as one might find alongside similar texts in contemporary manuscripts. And so almost all, just as a side note, almost all the other copies of the dispute survive alongside texts giving practical instructions on bloodletting, not in this case. Much of the work on pre-modern medicine has assumed a kind of spectrum that is reflected in the nature of the text. Philosophy lies at one end of the spectrum and practicality at the other. Large manuscripts were made to sit in libraries as repositories of classical thought, while smaller codices are automatically deemed portable and thus practical. And this is, an example of an eminently practical codex, a herbal with cures. This applies to the periodization of medicine as well. The dark or early Middle Ages are labeled an era of practical medicine because little of Galen's theoretical material circulated. And then theoretical or philosophical medicine returns in the age of the university when Arabic Galenism is translated into Latin. The Breton manuscript has hardly ever been mentioned within scholarship because it seems out of place, with its theological musings distant from the practice of medicine. Conversely, the most attention has been devoted to the herbals, as I've already indicated, which not only embody the practical, but are also most easily related to known authors of Greco-Roman antiquity. So people like Dioscorides, right? We have an author, so it's a worthy thing to study. As you might imagine, I'm arguing that such strict dichotomies between theory and practice are misleading. In fact, one of the most beloved texts of the early Middle Ages, Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, a book of all knowledge, as Peter Brown describes it, defined medicine as a second philosophy. Just as philosophy required knowledge of all the liberal arts, so grammar, rhetoric, astronomy, music, in order to care for the soul, Isidore declares, so does medicine require knowledge of those same arts in order to care for the body. Snippets from Isidore's section on medicine in the Etymologies made its way into all kinds of didactic treatises in Carolingian manuscripts. And his definition can go a long way in helping us understand the orientation of a medical expert. A broad education was necessary, but the aim was always to be able to put theory into practice. To read widely was necessary in order to enact a cure. The pairing of thought and deed, or word and action, was a binary underpinning much of Carolingian intellectual culture. They loved this binary. And medicine could embody it in an exemplary fashion, right? You could read, enact a cure, and perform charity in doing so as well. This comes across especially clearly in a unique set of letters found in a medical codex produced at the monastery of Saint-Denis in Paris around 850, and this is number 2 in the handout. As is often the case in this period, each individual letter in this book generally has parallels in contemporaneous manuscripts and perhaps a longer, unplottable transmission history. But the arrangement of the letters seems entirely the work of the Saint-Denis scribe, who grouped them, numbered them, titled them Book of Letters, and advanced throughout them an argument about the type of person a medicus should be. So medicus is the only term used by the Carolingians to express a doctor or healer, and it's always male in the sources. That's why I'm saying he. I found no references to female medica except as metaphors. Taken together, this book of letters presents the medicus as a highly learned individual, someone who is already educated, upright in conduct, and humble in approach before beginning training to become a doctor. Just so, one of the letters proclaims that a medicus ought to be the type of person who is so exceedingly competent with literature that while skimming through diverse numbers of books, he increases his thought and understanding and quickly discovers theory and skills. And above all, he should read the words of the philosophers. This reiterates ideas found in Isidore, and above all, emphasizes that the medicus is not a craftsman. Unlike professionals such as the surgeon in the later Middle Ages, the medicus does not learn primarily through hands-on experience. It is essential that he apply his knowledge, but his skill is rooted in text. We catch a brief glimpse of the long chain of copying and reworking text in this book of letters. We catch brief glimpses, and this is just one example. So if we go back to the Hippocratic Epidemics, which was written in the 5th century BCE, it situates the doctor's knowledge in terms of understanding the course of a disease and underscores that he must be able to, quote, speak the past, know the present, and predict the future. Another Hippocratic treatise, the Prognostics, opens by asserting that the doctor will gain his patient's confidence by foretelling things present, things past, and things to come. Isidore repeats a very similar line in his description of different types of medical books. And in our Saint-Denis manuscript, a letter titled From one Arsenius to Nepotianus declares that as part of his operations, the medicus is always, quote, demonstrating present things, announcing future things, and making evident eternal things. So we have a similar line that appears in 4 totally different contexts, right? The first is basically a set of case histories. The second, a description of how to perform a prediction of the course of an illness. The third, a definition of different types of medical texts. And then the fourth, a description of who a doctor is. And the line itself changes subtly, as you can see. Why does any of this matter? Because these small editorial changes signal broader shifts in the medieval conception of the physician. Indeed, the way in which scribes subtly shaped the classical and late antique tradition to their own ends was a means of promoting a new Christian ideal about the healer. Here, instead of ascribing to the observant physician the power of simply rationally deducing the future, right, looking at what happened in the past and saying, okay, this is what's likely to happen in the future, the letter of Arsenius claims the realm of eternal truths as part of the medicus's prerogative. This explicitly defined him as an intercessor between earth and heaven, someone able to access God's domain just like the saints, priests, and other pure individuals. I will admit the change in wording could be read as relatively insignificant, except for the fact that several of the letters in the Saint-Denis collection argue for the medicus as a spiritual caretaker. In contrast to what Isidore states in the etymologies, that care of the soul and body run parallel, these texts assume that the treatment of soul and body intersect in critical fashion, not under the priest, but under the eye of the medicus. It is a worthy declaration to call such a person a medicus, who is responsible for the health of the soul and the health of the body, by which means let us not ask of him who fashioned the soul and body by his order. So reads another letter that equates the responsibilities of the physician in protecting the well-being of his patients with the love that God demonstrated toward humanity in his original fashioning of Adam and Eve. God is the creator of the body and soul, but the medicus here becomes the divine protector of these entities during their temporal life. The implicit argument is that the health of body and soul are symbiotic. The body cannot be treated effectively without consideration of the soul. Assumptions that early medieval medicine can be primarily characterized by folk qualities. In other words, the practical cures favored by a rural populace are its most distinguishing element, and that healers, even if they were monks, were a superstitious bunch who loved cures about to do with vulture parts and things like that. Right? These assumptions don't hold up if we focus seriously on these short epistolary texts. Yes, the early medieval medicus practiced in a far different climate from the university-trained physicist. However, the statements in the manuscripts not only undermine the belief that he was unlearned, but directly relate his learning to his pious ability to intercede in the health of the soul. So to begin to wrap things up, I'd like to turn now to two Carolingian medical manuscripts, both from the early decades of the 9th century, and both including illumination that, and this is really unusual for medical codices, are not depictions of herbs or animals, right? That's what most of our illustrations are. And I hope that an examination of these decorative schemes can make even more apparent some of the prevailing 9th century attitudes that we've just seen in the Book of Letters, particularly those ideas that link the healing of the body with a mandate from God and thereby cast the medicus in a sanctified light. So the first codex, which is number 3 in the handout, is a relatively small book from northern Italy, possibly the monastery of Bobbio. And it seems to have been folded. And this suggests it may have been carted around by a traveling physician, right? We can't say with any certainty, but this codex has typically been cast an example of practical medicine. The original front cover, as you can see, has sketches of Christ, Mary, monks, and other figures. And then the title running across the first page reads, "In the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, here begins the sacred art of medicine." And again, a side note, the Saint Denis Book of Letters also refers to medicine as a sacred art. The eye, as you can see, is a braided cross running down the left side of the page. And at the crossbar, we have a medallion of a beardless Christ framed by a nimbus. And then the text that follows the title, right, the text here, is a question and answer explanation of phlebotomy that opens with a decorated cue containing 2 figures holding a codex. Almost certainly these represent the master and student who are participating in the didactic dialogue about bloodletting. What is bloodletting? It is an incision of the vein. Which vein do we let? Very, very practical. Although the illuminations seem hastily executed, they layer this rather mundane text with weighty theological associations. The letting of blood is set against Christ's sacrificial blood on the cross. And we have these red patches on his face. The student-teacher pair and Christ are set side by side through the parallel of their jointly encircled forms, with the implication that the labor of performing bloodletting is overseen or endorsed by God. And finally, the so-named sacred art of human healing is set within the medicinal grace of the incarnation and passion. And that is the theological belief that God cured the world of the disease of sin by sending Christ as medicine. All of these arguments for sanctifying medicine occur in conjunction with a text devoted to the techniques of phlebotomy, right? A messy manual craft that the later university physician will delegate to the barber surgeon. right? Again, this is a very hands-on, very practically oriented text. Similar themes are at play in a medical manuscript produced at around the same time at a scriptorium in central France, which contains the Latin translations of 3 late antique Greek works by Dioscorides or Abesius and a Byzantine author, Alexander. Prefacing the start of the therapeutics of the 6th century Byzantine author is a pair of arches with motifs common to Gospel book illumination. Under the first arch, right here, we have Alexander, described as the wise medicus, who published this little book of the art of medicine. Under the second arch stands another braided cross, surrounded by the entreaty, "Holy Cross, save us, because through you Christ will redeem us by his most holy blood." The complementary archways draw connections between sickness and sin, the temporal recovery of the body and eternal resurrection, and human healing and divine sacrifice. Not to frame a liturgical or exegetical collection, but a set of practical remedies for internal diseases. And these remedies included the use of amulets, incantations, and unusual substances like wolf feces, right? Things typically classed as folk cures. Alexander, encircled with a halo, is aligned with Christ, who is often known as the divine physician. His cures are imbued with the grace of God's assistance. And this message is amplified by the incipit on the following page, which, as you can see in the handout, invokes Christ as a guarantor of Alexander's work. If this is indeed, and something I'd like to hear from other people, if this is indeed a cupping glass, right? So people maybe have seen like Michael Phelps, other Olympians getting cupping on the back to draw out the humors, right? And you apply it, right? Alexander's sitting there with the end to be applied to the flesh, facing outward. So if that is a cupping glass, which is the best hypothesis I've had so far, we again have a link between the manual work of the physician and the medicinal work of God's blood, as well as between individual suffering and the redemption of humanity. Though not numerous, right? There are not many illuminations like these. Examples of Christianizing illuminations across the early medieval medical corpus. There is this one also from Monte Cassino, which is right at the frontiers of the Carolingian Empire. But these are Christian symbols, right? They're visual signs of medicine's legitimacy that even an illiterate patient could comprehend. In addition to sanctifying the text itself, they surely endow the practitioner carrying the codex with religious authority. It's especially true in the case of this folded manuscript. Furthermore, images of Christ and the cross were instruments that could be activated within the economy of healing, affecting miraculous cures themselves, right? If you touch them, engage with them, kiss them. Endowing remedies with potency, warding off evil, and referencing perhaps objects and physical gestures that were performed in visitations to the sick. These illuminations were not practical in the sense of helping a reader identify a herb or execute a surgery, but they were far from ornamental. So, though we have touched on only a handful of early medieval manuscripts in this talk, I have tried to offer a variety of examples of the invisible intellectual labor that scribes performed in executing these codices. It is true that many of the texts, or at least the roots of the text, are not Carolingian creations. Yet the meaning of inherited texts could be radically shifted by the ways in which scribes formed new combinations of material, how they edited and interpolated writings, and how they framed them with illuminations and titles, right? And a really good example with the Alexander text here. The material products that survive reveal efforts to Christianize a pagan tradition, to more deeply enmesh the health of the body with the health of the soul, and to frame the ideal practitioner as a sanctified divine agent. If we recognize these efforts, we should also acknowledge the false binary that is created by charting medical innovation according to the sliding scale of the theoretical versus the practical. Theory could masquerade as theology in the early Middle Ages, but this didn't make it any less a philosophical reflection on the meaning of medicine, nor did such reflections demarcate a codex as any less practical than a compilation of herbal cures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was wonderful. And we're now going to switch screens so that we see you all. And the floor is open for discussion. So again, please, if you put your questions in the chat, Zach will read them out, but we'd much rather really hear you. So please, use the raise hand function and I can call on you. I guess to get things started, I'm wondering, Meg, whether you could consider for us the parallels between the role of the medicus, who is a practical worker, but also much more and performing a function that we can say is either physical or spiritual, because they're coming together, and the role of the scribe, right, who is also a practical worker, but in your reading is doing something much more than simply copying text, but is constructing texts and constructing precisely the kind of overlap of the physical and the spiritual that you're saying the medicus does. So again, what is the relationship between the scribal work here and the medicus's work? Is that level of engagement by the shaping engagement by the scribe something that you also see as typical of Carolingian, or less so? I mean, is this special? Is this typical? Anyway, bunch of questions to throw at you.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it makes me think of Cassiodorus. I think said, unless I'm mixing it up, I think he's the one who said, in writing, the scribe, every stroke that the scribe makes is a lash against the devil. So the work of the scribe as really waging a cosmic battle almost in that case. And so yeah, I think that there are a lot of parallels between this kind of. I really think. For the Carolingians in particular, we need to rethink the idea of the practical. When we think of the care of the soul also, it's very practically oriented, right? We have all of these penitentials. If you do this sin, this is the penance, right? These long lists, trying to categorize, but also simplify everything so that you can really quickly and effectively provide a cure. And those penitentials look extremely similar to the lists of remedies, people have looked at these remedies and kind of thought of them as being, reflective of this folk medicine, maybe useful, but, there's not much thought there. But I think if we compare them to the penitentials and say, well, there's just as much thought, it's a very similar organization to the penitentials. We know the Carolingians care about the soul. So why can't we say that they also cared about the body? There's a kind of elevation of the one and ignoring of the other, even though they actually, I think, to me, they look quite similar. And in terms of the scribe and the medicus, I think also there's a way in which all of this is taking place in the same environment, right? The scribe who is copying these medical texts is most likely at a monastery. Medical care is definitely taking place at a monastery. I don't think it's just for monks. I think enough evidence to suggest that there are probably lots of people coming to the monastery to receive bloodletting and other treatment, and that in fact the doctors lodged within the monastery may not have been monks themselves. They may have just kind of seen that as a site of practice. So,
to what extent are the scribes copying the text versus shaping new texts by creating these juxtapositions?
Well, that's, I feel people keep wanting to say, well, they're just reproductive, right? In being that, they are productive. They're producing new text. And, I think what's really interesting, as I tried to suggest with medicine, is that there seems to be more license to reshape these texts than with other kinds of material, right? Hagiography, theology, maybe not so much with liturgy, but, history writing as well. We do see this in other genres, but medicine has not been recognized as something like that. Instead, it's just this typical idea that the early Middle Age is so conservative and they're just copying stuff, when really, there's a lot of thought there.
Oh, this is fascinating. Thank you so much, Meg. Just thinking about the language too. I just got thinking, the whole notion of the medicus versus the physicus, also the idea of the surgeon barber. Presumably women are involved in some way that doesn't show up here at all. thinking about what follows later, you know, in terms of how doctors proceeded, often, you know, based on theoretical things, but not having practical knowledge. And in fact, the people who were actually doing the cures were people who understood better what these herbal properties were, and often, you know, they, you know, so that there's this funny thing going on here that moves ahead into the future and really does affect medicine for a long time in terms of how people see doctors or the male, you know, authority versus, you know, the kinds of more practical things that would come through these other avenues. So I think it's just fascinating to think about this being the background for how that then came into being, and how we, you know, how we have that kind of thing. It's not really a question. It just got me thinking about the future of medicine and the division. I mean, in some ways you have something similar in chemistry. You know, you have alchemy being something theoretical, but then you have the practical side of it. And while, you know, there is a claim to certain practicality for certain things, it isn't always the case that, you know, these were actually successful ways of doing it. And there's something interesting too about the whole notion of the medicus as almost a kind of seer, seeing into the future. So it's a kind of odd thing, you know, the kinds of claims that are being made here. You said demonstrating the present, announcing future things, and making evident eternal things. And there seems to be a way in which, you know, that, you know, you want to make the claim, but how many people actually die versus who are being cured? So, you know, thinking about medicine as something that's actually practically curing the body, versus, you know, maybe making these claims about the soul. So it was just observations and things that made me think about, which are really fascinating. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I mean, in terms of, I mean, you're right, of course, a lot of patients probably die, but I mean, the doctor's ability even to predict death is seen to be as, you know, very important. I think this is something my students really struggle with in classes when they don't, you know, they see the doctor as someone who, if he does not cure, he's unsuccessful. But for, you know, and this is not specific to the early Middle Ages, but so much of the doctor's role is just to provide some guidance about what is going to happen, whether life or death. And so to really acknowledge that, I think is essential. But I think just in terms of what you were saying earlier, I mean, for me, what's really interesting is the way that bloodletting changes. And I in some ways, I've just been thinking about this more as I was writing this talk, because, you know, it seems so important in the 9th century, and really to be something that is elevated in this particular way. And, you know, it receives, so we have this architectural schema of like an ideal monastery. And, you know, there's a whole room devoted to bloodletting. It seems it's very important. It comes up in Carolingian legislation. It's one of the few times that we see any kind of medical practice being mentioned in legal texts. But then bloodletting is going to become the kind of crassest, or, you know, this dirtiest form of medicine. You know, the physician won't do it. And, you know, it comes to really define this hierarchy of healers that we have in the later Middle Ages, which just doesn't exist in the early Middle Ages. There's no hierarchy as far as we can tell. It's more about comparisons of the doctor, the saint, and the magician as someone else. You know, other scholars have made this point. But what I see to be key, you know, where other people have argued that it's trying to kind of pit the doctor against the saint, the doctor who provides the natural world, the saint, the supernatural. I just don't see that in the manuscripts. I see this real argument being made instead that the doctor is like the saint, that they're very similar, that they engage in a similar realm.
Can I ask just as a follow-up? I mean, the other piece that's always interesting is urine and the use of urine and looking at urine. Does that ever show up in this early?
It's really not. It's not such a big element of it, because that's coming kind of more from the Byzantines. That more in the material that is translated from Greek and Arabic. So it's not as big a deal.
A great image of urine color.
Right. Because I was thinking there is that same kind of aspect to it, though. You know,
And
reading
with
the urine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask about the other direction coming from religious studies, I guess. There is a religious dimension to medicine always, and obviously, like, how is that reflected in this? I mean, isn't there a side that it's kind of putting medicine inside of context of thinking of it theologically, or how would this illuminate? What is it doing on the like concept of what religion is? Because I think that's what seeing these wonderful examples you brought, I thought that it's also telling us something about how people are kind of trying to have the religion kind of swallow this medicine happening. I don't even know what words to use because I think it's like it goes both directions. It's something that religion is reflecting on medicine, but it's something that how religion talks and medicine reflects on how people are perceiving religion.
Yeah, well, I mean, what interests me is that, so the Carolingians undertaking really extensive religious, educational reforms, and a lot is seen to be included within that orbit. But medicine has never really been thought to be an element of the Carolingian reform, right? When you see a discussion of reforms, no one ever mentions that the medicine is part of it. In part, that's because there's this assumption that in late antiquity, the issue was kind of dealt with, like the church fathers settled, but it was okay to practice medicine, done deal. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that some of that went on with some of the Greek fathers, but in the Latin West, there's not a lot of this material from the Greek fathers. So it's really an open question. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's also a lot of uncertainty because the texts are written by people known to be pagans, and because the texts contain these things which do seem slightly magical. So there's a lot of suspicion there, and so we see, I didn't mention one the most famous medical manuscript actually from the 9th century. I didn't mention, but it has this defense of medicine that entirely justifies it within this religious context. Like, what does it mean to even cure the body? Is it even legitimate? Shouldn't we just have our faith in God? This is what the others in my society would say, but I'm answering them and providing an explanation, a theological explanation that really says no. We can put our faith in God, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't, as humans, try to do what we can, and that both trust in God and human enterprise can exist simultaneously. There's no conflict there. If that gets at your question.
Well, there's a few comments from the chat that I'll pass on. A couple questions. Steve Python says probably most doctors in most areas outside of plague time took care of minor illnesses and injuries that would get better, perhaps as well without the doctor, but probably some measures help. So death was not invariably a concern. I think that's a good point to remember that people might have been relying on doctors for a whole range of things, not necessarily potentially fatal. We had a question from Madeline Pierucci, a couple of questions. Was there any upside to the practice of bloodletting? Medically. But she also asked, what happened to a medicus if you were not a Christian?
Yeah.
Was there any hope of taking them seriously, inviting them into the conversation at all? So how did they kind of adjudicate dialogue with non-Christians?
Yeah. Well, so there is this case. And there are not many cases, but there's at least two cases that I know of that reference Jewish doctors in the early Middle Ages. And one of them is the criticism from Gregory Tour, like this terrible idea, don't go see a Jewish doctor. The other case is that Charles the Bald, who is emperor of the Carolingian, he's the grandson of Charlemagne, and he supposedly had a Jewish doctor. But again, the Jewish doctor supposed to have poisoned him and caused his death. So we know that there are at least some Jews practicing medicine. We know that in fact they could reach fairly elevated positions with really limited evidence. So people have made a lot of claims that can't actually be supported by the evidence. But we know that a few of them could receive this title of royal medicus. But it's a dangerous position to be in. And I guess I read some of this insistence in, say, the Saint-Denis Book of Letters, this insistence that the medicus is Christian, is pious, as reflecting a kind of on the ground situation where, again, there's more openness, there's more flexibility. We have people practicing in this profession who don't live up to this ideal, and thus this need to kind of ensure that the boundaries are made firm, right? Because we are dealing with the care of the body, which is a religious endeavor, right? So
that association, that persists into the early modern period with Elizabeth, the first doctor, Lopez, who's the doctor who was accused of poisoning, pretending to poison her. What about text though? Like, so could the same techniques be applied to Hebrew, Jewish, medical texts as was applied to classical texts?
Yeah, I mean, we just don't, as far as I know, have, it's a very different situation than in like the 13th and 14th centuries. So we have like, lots of evidence of Hebrew science and of, Jewish participation in medicine in Spain, it's lively Jewish practice. Yeah, I just don't, I don't know. Yeah.
I have just a couple of questions, kind of observations, putting my art historian hat on some of the iconography.
Yes,
which is
please, yeah.
Really interesting. I'm not familiar with these, these particular traditions of illumination particularly, but this St. Gall manuscript, I mean, this initial I,
Mhm.
you have to, I guess, compare it to other illumination from maybe Bobbio, maybe northern Italy, but the bottom of the eye, I mean, this looks like a needle to me, with, that sort of piercing, at the bottom, the cave with these sort of, I mean, if it's a discussion of phlebotomy, I mean, maybe that's something to, I mean, it could be incidental, but, and the fact that Christ is sort of part of this sort of instrument, and that sort of got me thinking about the sort of poesis that different authors in the Middle Ages expressed about parchment being skin and ink being blood, I don't know, it just struck me, I mean, that, I mean, that might be reading too much.
Or the whole thing is a knife?
Yeah, a knife or a needle, or, and that there's drops of blood, but there's also, I'm not sure if you could take that, there's also looks like there's a little, I mean, it could just be ornamental, you have, and then the other thing is the BNF 9332, that's very great. This is what from, this is Breton, this is sort of,
Sorry,
where is it, where is this thought to be from? The
Blurry.
Really, okay, so like Northern French, this Alexander, he has a halo, I think, right? I mean, which is, I mean, he's not a saint, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that just struck me as very, I mean, it really reinforces your point, right?
Yeah.
That this is I mean, he looks like a gospel author.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we go back to like the first page of my talk, right? This is from this, most famous Carolingian medical manuscript, the Roche Arsenal, and it's a poem that's titled Cosmos Damian. These are two saints who were physicians, but then turned Christian. But then beside them, and in equal height, right, equal script, Hippocrates and Galen.
Right.
Right. So it's really this equating of the Christian healer and the pagan healer, right? I think it's a real argument, even just in the title there, to try to present them as, these are both viable options. They can be, they can be blended, without conflict, just like the really similar to the letter of Luke, right? You can turn kind of pagan things to Christian ends.
Right. But it seems striking with this Alexander. I didn't much known about him. I mean, it's sort of I mean, there was respect for Aristotle as a pagan philosopher, but you would never see him with a halo, right?
Yeah.
That would be sort of totally.
I know.
It just seems so interesting, and you kind of wonder. I mean, this looks like it's probably illuminated by the person who's the scribe as well, perhaps. So, or perhaps not, right? Maybe, but just the conflation of the kind of evangelist author portrait with, I just think it really visually reinforces your larger.
It is really surprising, though, right? I mean, so there are a few art historians who talked about this image, but not in the context of medicine. And then nobody's talking about medicine who's really discussed these images. And then when you look at them, it does seem to be that we have very powerful arguments here about, sanctifying the healer of the body. And so I'm glad you seem to agree. But do you think that is a cupping glass, perhaps?
What was that?
Do you have any thoughts on the cupping glass?
That I didn't know what that device was before.
Yeah.
you mentioned it, so I couldn't-
And wait, what does that do? What is
So
Michael Phelps doing when he's doing that?
It's supposed to, suction the humorous surface of the skin, so that if you have excess
You create a little
vacuum. Yeah. Yeah, like Michael Phelps.
Yeah, I know, I remember that now that you said that, but what the hell was that doing?
It's in circulation.
That answers the question about blood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No
Well,
one's
there's been
going
a
to-
revival of blood lettering.
What else could it be? I mean, it's not a book.
It's
You
not a
know, it's
book.
really not depicted as you would see a codex or a scroll or something.
I thought a building at first,
Well,
because they usually hold a building, right,
Yeah.
but it's not not a particularly good building, looks like a brick shed there.
Well, what did they, when they let blood, it is red.
It could,
Go
right.
into a cup.
Yeah.
It just would be facing the wrong,
Yeah,
it would be a
it's
weird way to hold it,
Right,
right,
right.
because it looks like the opening is.
Yeah.
So that's why I feel like it would almost make more sense for it to be a bloodletting cup, because we hear more about bloodletting than we do about cupping. But it's just that the angle of it to
Yeah.
me is
So, and what are the earliest cups that we
Yeah.
have extant?
there are some from antiquity that look a little bit similar.
So and they're that rectilinear, that angle?
They're a
and-
little bit more rounded.
Yeah, I mean, usually,
Yeah,
the modern cups are round.
yeah.
All this top.
Yeah, but I mean, there are some that have this kind of lippy like thing on the edge, even if they are more rounded. So I think it doesn't discount it, although it isn't stunning evidence in favor of it either. That's why I kind of hung up on it.
Very fascinating.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I'm not a medievalist, so I'm going to pose a very speculative question. But I was really interested in the anecdote that you started with about the worry about the dogs licking up the blood and how that sort of would prove that the soul could be the blood. And then when you reference later to using practical things like wolf feces. So I was just thinking about like the role of animals here, and I was wondering, like, do you see that as they're sort of trying to bring like this divinity to medical practice, if there was any sort of need to distance from like the very, biology that's closer to animals, or any need to distance them? Because yeah, I've just been thinking too about how, contemporary that divide between human and animals can often come into play in medical practice nowadays with like, replacing parts, things like that. Animal bodies. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I don't know that they see animal products as being that different than the plant product. I mean, so a lot of, manuscripts, they'll include, herbals, and then alongside a herbal text will be and here are how to use different parts of animals. And I don't know that they see that much. I mean, all of these are natural substances that, according to, some of these texts, such as in the Book of Letters, were put on earth for human use. Humans should, employ them in order to create cures from them. I don't know that there's a lot of anxiety about, I mean, historians, scholars have read these as being, superstition when they invoke weird substances like wolf feces or parts of a vulture. These have been categorized as superstition. But I don't know that there's really any need to see certain substances as that much more superstitious than others. I mean, they're all natural products. They might gross us out, but, I don't know that was true for them in the same way. People lived also alongside all of these substances, right? Not to suggest the Middle Ages were dirty, but I mean that, come on, there were animals all around. And so I don't know that some of these substances would have seemed so exotic to them.
Thanks. This is so much fun, Megan. Really learning so much. I maybe just to turn things a little bit, I love to think more about the manuscripts that you're working on as manuscripts, because I feel like you're breaking down the healer versus spiritual guide distinction, or saying there isn't one. And now I'm starting to wonder about the distinction between, what we might call a medical manuscript and a theological manuscript, or even the fields thereof, in a way that, we tend to categorize things, and that sounds like that's not going to work either. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about your beyond Vectoria and the codices you're seeing, or these, or anything you want, and just, I mean, and what is it that you see in such a manuscript? What is it that hasn't been seen? What are the divisions we ought to use or not taught to use when we talk about these things?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it kind of goes in two directions, because on the one hand, I think we do need to expand our category of what is medical, but on the other hand, I think we, kind of other the Middle Ages too much if we say they didn't have a conception of the medical. And so I do use the term medical manuscripts, I use the term medicine, because they do seem, there are a lot of manuscripts that contain just what we also would consider medical material. And in library catalogs, we see books of medicine, 3 volumes of medicine. So they do have a sense of genre cohesion. And this is why, Beccaria, he's not wrong, right? I mean, a lot of the manuscripts that he found, I mean, he hit upon the major medical codices. And so certainly this group, of which I'm a member, I'm not the organizer, I also should add, it's not that we're discovering huge volumes filled with medical material, but it is an attempt to say, okay, the kinds of texts that appear in medical manuscripts also appear in other types of collections. Some of the most prominent being anything to do with computed, so the calculation of time, astronomy. There's often then bloodletting texts and dietary texts according to the month found in these collections. But we also have, so the Psychomachia is a text on the war between the virtues and the vices. For example, there's a manuscript where somebody failed to do the drawings that often accompany that text, and in the space for those drawings, someone later filled in a bunch of medical remedies and cures. I think that's interesting because terms such as virtus and vice, vitium, these are in the spiritual literature, but they also are used extensively in the medical material. So is it a coincidence that someone filled in the space of that text with medicine? I don't think so, right? There are connections going on here. On the other hand, that doesn't happen that often, right? So what's really intriguing to me is that there are these overlaps, and yet there are also clear attempts to separate. So for example, hagiography. I only know of, I think, just one manuscript that has a work of hagiography. It's actually the earlier scribe, a passion of Cosmas and Damien, within alongside medical text. But if there were just simply blurred boundaries, you would expect that to happen much, much more frequently. So it's not a good answer, but
It's sort of like,
attempt to give an
what's
honest
miscellaneous
answer.
about a miscellany or what isn't organic? Yeah.
But okay, so later on, I guess later on, you have the notion of the body politic. Okay. Do you have the state described in medical terms as a healthy body, right? And is that the kind of place, I mean, if you have those in Carolingian manuscripts, is that a place where you may be reading it as a political text, but in fact it's so infused with medical knowledge and medical theory that it's also a medical text. It's telling you something about how the well-ordered body is conceived.
That's what I hope. So when I began this project, I thought that I would find lots of those texts that were using medicine in ways that you could tell someone had been reading the medical text and then was applying it to the ideas of the body politic. There is so this text biography of Louis Pius, Charlemagne's son, written by the astronomer, because we don't know who it was. That's a text where I think clearly we see someone who is very familiar with medicine and is applying it to the body of the state and the body of the emperor. But that's an unusual case. I think in most other cases, what we see is when medical theories of the state are being invoked, instead, I think that's a reference to a long, that's a different transmission chain that goes back through the church fathers. Thinking about metaphors such as like Christ the physician, that it doesn't necessarily intersect that clearly with medicine. So I've struggled to really clearly connect those, if that makes sense. It happens, but it's not as frequent as I would like.
Curious about who we would think see these manuscripts. At one point, I said, these Christian symbols might reassure a patient.
Yeah.
And I had not imagined that patients would be seeing this book because I would have thought that the medicus would not want to be seen in a book. If he's supposed to be
Yeah.
sort of divine
Yeah.
in the future, you know, have this
Glancing through
spiritual.
it in
Yeah.
the waiting room or.
So then, you know, are these, I have to think of these really as
Yeah.
you know, self-image,
Yeah.
that is to bolster themselves, you know, this profession for themselves.
Yeah.
But were these outwardly directed to that?
I mean, yeah, and it's very interesting because yeah, I think that maybe that reflects more our understanding of what a doctor, a doctor should just know. And if the doctor
Yeah.
doesn't know, you're worried, and that's why they're
Right.
like, secretly going and do that. But I mean, if literacy, I mean, the text is itself such a much more sanctified object. I don't know that it looks bad to be looking, I mean, you have a text, whoa, I mean, that's cool, like.
No, in
I don't
fact,
know
it's
that
the other way.
yeah,
It's an
distracting.
ennobling thing. Right?
Exactly, I think so, yeah.
So
Yeah,
you
I do
picture some of these being carried to
I
the
really
house of
do.
the patient.
I mean, I don't want to make too much of the folded manuscript because so much is made of these folds, but I mean, it's like, how much can we really read into this? But it is folded. It does suggest it could have been stuffed in a pocket or a travel case. And yeah, brought out, like, we know that people are going to homes, right? Again, another very rare case of a kind of legislation that reflects something about healing. We have, called to perform the unction of the sick. So, priests were very likely going to people's houses. Were those same priests, considered in some guys as a medicus, as someone who maybe also was trained in medicine or had, used some of these cures, and so, went to both use holy oil and also, give a potion or perform a bloodletting.
But you don't find any staining.
Yeah, that's a
Potions,
good.
blood and.
I don't, this is not my area of expertise, and as far as I knew, that hasn't, I can't think of any example where someone has found this yet. But again, these manuscripts are really not, I really have to say, they're just not been studied very much, so it's very possible.
You have the back books from later, but that's much later, like 14th century, the medical withholding almanacs that supposedly were carried around.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and consulting would be considered something appropriate to do. You're consulting,
Yeah.
this text, which is going to help you, not that you don't have any expertise, but that consulting is kind of comforting thing to the person who is ill.
And we have, so with prognostics, we have texts that you would have to bring with you because you couldn't memorize. So
Yeah.
so tables, add up the person's name, divide by 30, and
Right.
the numbers in the first half of the sphere, do this, bottom half, he died, right?
Yeah.
You can't memorize that, so that would be a whole ritual that you would perform.
Fine.
What about use of the calendar? We know about the importance of doing bloodletting only
Yeah.
at certain days.
Yeah.
Is that part of this repertoire?
Absolutely. So Egyptian days, this idea that there's dangerous days where you can't perform bloodletting. This is the kind of text that comes up often in these Caputus collections, or even just in random, like if you have a kind of collection of, liberal arts knowledge, or I'm trying to think of some of the examples I've looked at recently. Yeah, geography and these encyclopedias. Egyptian days are something that, I'm going to bet you 95% is there. They're all over the place. So that certainly with the Beyond Beccaria group tries to, look and see, okay, under what circumstances would people have encountered something that they would consider probably to be medical in some fashion, given how it appears also in medical codices. And Egyptian days, dietary, like eat this in the 12 months of the year. Short remedies for this or that appear in all kinds of empty spaces in manuscripts.
But it's interesting because on the one hand, I feel like you're opening up a case of medicine that's going to be all these different places. But on the other hand, there's something what you're saying too. It's also there's a kind of almost professionalizing, closing
It is
off.
a little
Only
bit.
the most holy
Yes.
and sacred person can be also the healer. So you're shutting out
Yeah.
all those Jewish doctors
Yeah.
and everybody else.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of profession. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
totally anachronistic term. But you see what I
But a
mean.
little bit. And I mean, I do think, it is this, it's the complexity where you probably have these Jewish practitioners who can end up being royal doctors, but at the same time, you have this increasingly severe rhetoric that the medicus must be
Yeah.
Christian and must be
Yeah.
a particular type of Christian.
When do we first see the influence of Islamic medicine on?
Yeah.
Christian?
So not until, not until around Constantinople. So not until about the 11th century, this is happening in Salerno and around in Montecassino. Not happening supposedly at all in the Carolingian period. But we know, right? I mean, this is just something that I'm kind of hypothesizing at the moment. I have very few facts to back this up. But I mean, we know things like spices, incense, silks, water clocks. There are a bunch of things moving from east to west. And we actually, things that other scholars work on, we can see them changing, as I said, ingredient lists to reflect new substances. So products are moving, but no one ever thinks that texts are moving or that knowledge is moving in terms of medicine. And I think we need to question that. But I don't really have evidence. I don't have a text I can say, oh, this was translated from Arabic into Latin. But there's such an ingrained assumption that no one in the early Middle Ages is doing any translation work. If it happens in Italy, always in Italy. Anything that is new is written in Italy.
Would it have been revolutionary in light of what you presented as medical Christian? Would the revolution have been acknowledged in any text saying we have to open up, or the fact that things have changed is just accepted without any to do?
I mean, I don't think it would have been an issue at all to translate stuff from Arabic.
No, I'm not talking about translating, but to acknowledge. I see. Right. In other words, as long as a Christian was a practitioner.
Yeah. Or that the text had been worked through, right? That's what the letter from Luke said. It's totally fine to be taking things. I mean, just as the Abbasids thought as well, right? They describe, like, we've taken this from the Greeks and this from the Persians and, this from the Romans, and we're bringing it together, and, this is the future. I mean, the Carolingians similarly, and actually, right? I mean, I'd like to just point out that both of these dynasties, right? Carolingians, the Abbasids, they come to power almost the same year, 750, right? And they both, I mean, the Abbasids are well recognized as spurring on the scientific renaissance that includes medicine. The Carolingians are not recognized as doing that, but I would argue that they are. I think we need to see medicine as part of the way that these dynasties are competing for power in the Mediterranean, are trying to, assert that they own the Roman, a Roman inheritance, right? It is a religious political act that medicine, and medicine is part of that kind of claim for legitimacy. And that hasn't, I mean, no one has suggested that, but I think we can speculate about that a bit.
I just have a super quick follow-up, especially after this discussion of sort of like global circulation, and then back to like the use of these and possibly bringing up homes. I mean, I know you said you're not sure exactly, but I'm wondering, like, if these have obviously survived such a long time. Do you have any sense of like how often they circulated, even just locally or between different medicines, or like must have been kept in libraries to have been survived this long?
I mean, manuscripts are hardy, I would tell you, and someone else can. I mean, I think, just it's not a foregone conclusion that if they circulated, they would be destroyed. I do think, again, like, just looking at the patterns, it suggests that there is a large volume of material that was lost. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to talk about circulation. So supposedly, this Lorcher Arts and I book, supposedly it never circulated because there's only the one copy, no other copies made. But I would say I found these very interesting parallels in a few other authors from slightly later than this codex was produced around 800. So, I would say there are hints of things circulating in a way that hasn't been acknowledged, but there's not, resounding evidence.
Are the texts bound together with other texts? And if so, at what point do you think they're assembled?
Sorry, which
Are your texts bound
Yeah.
together with other texts?
I mean, sometimes they're bound together. Yeah, so I mean, we'll have like, a medical collection that is then bound very clearly with a separate, two contemporaneous, one medical, one liturgical, that are then later bound together, and we can't really say for sure when that occurred. But I mean, is there this clear division between, once it's bound together, does that make it that it's in a library? I mean, liturgical texts also presumably are being used and employed in particular ways. So I don't know.
We've got that one, what I thought was a kind of remarkable moment when someone writes in, copies in, who was it? Augustine, a medical text. He said, in the 12th century.
Yeah.
And, I feel like that's kind of more remarkable than you might think. Like, it's easy to forget that we're dealing with fairly distant past, but 300 years later,
Yeah.
someone finds this manuscript and writes a new text, and it would be like finding something from the early 1700s.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a pretty striking moment of reception, I think. That's that it's
Yeah.
around 300 years later, and that someone is happy to write a new bit into it 300 years
Yeah.
later, and doesn't view it as years of one time. Doesn't view it as in any way kind of alien
Yeah.
to them.
Yeah.
That would prevent,
Yeah.
a continuation of this project.
Yeah, well, I love that because I just think, maybe you disagree, but I just think it's super much confirms the idea that scribe in the 12th century sees this as a
Yes,
compilation on the
Absolutely.
soul.
It's a reading
So
of the
what
rest
am
of
I
the
gonna add
manuscript.
to that? Yeah.
Completely. Yeah, very good. I mean, that, it makes me also wonder about where's this scribe encountering this? Is this in a monastery? Is it somewhere where there's some institutional
Yeah,
continuity?
I know. The problem is we don't, for this manuscript, no one, we have no place. Right, it's a bit iffy on, that was written in Brittany, that is actually all based on just, I think we incipit to the Erosius text, so, it's very, very hard to say, it's something I really struggle with. I have no names, I can't name any scribes, locations are super iffy, readership is super iffy. There's just a lot we don't know. And that's partly why people have said, just don't touch it with a 10-foot pole, but there's a lot there.
Well, thank you so much. We've learned so much, including that Carolingian doctors seem to have made house calls, which puts them way ahead of us. And again, thank you so much for those of us in the room. We do have medical manuscripts, although later.
We have one 9th-century manuscript, but it's not medical, but it's.
Right.
Did you bring it? Okay.
For the next, but for those present and on screen, we'd like to just thank you for.